All right, it is 11 a.m. and we're going to get going. There are still people trickling in, but they're only, as I was telling the panelists earlier, they're only going to miss me talking, and I think that's fine. My name's Colin Rowan. I'm the Director of Communication for Pecan Street. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We've got a really full agenda today, so we wanted to start right on time, get right to it, so that we can have some time for discussion afterward. Today's webinar is about Pecan Street's more than 10 years of research on EVs and EV charging. And EVs are very hot in the news today, of course, not just because of the Inflation Reduction Act, but just because of general market forces. Everyone on this webinar is quite aware of the wave of electrification in transportation. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about whether this wave is coming. It's here. And we've been researching it for about 10 years with the research participants that we have connected through our network around the country. So I'm just going to go through some very quick housekeeping. This event and all of our events are listed at pecanstreet.org/events. There will be a YouTube video of this later on today once we're finished with it. If you didn't get this invitation directly from us, you got it from someone else, you can email us at media@pecanstreet.org and we will add you to our distribution lists. And of course, you can go to pecanstreet.org for more information about our EV research and all of our energy research. I'm going to be monitoring questions throughout the presentation today. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function. We're going to try to get to questions, and I'm going to be trying to inventory them as we move forward. So grouping them into similar questions so that Scott and Cavan can respond to them in kind. Your speakers today are Scott Hinson. He's the Chief Technology Officer for Pecan Street, and Cavan Merski, who is our data analyst. And I'm your moderator. I'll be here asking questions to them as topics pop up. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. With that, I'm going to hand it right over to Cavan. He's going to get us started. And Cavan, it is all yours.
Great, thanks, Colin. Like Colin said, I'm an analyst for Pecan Street, and I've gathered some trends today to talk about, the history of our data and what we've seen in charging patterns over the last decade, and talk about what that means for the future and how we need to take cues from these insights to develop the charging infrastructure and patterns that are optimal and that we need. So you go to the next slide, okay. So this slide, so a little background, our equipment measures at the circuit level for each home at a second-by-second frequency, how much power is being consumed. So we're able to measure how much power an EV charger is pulling each second. And what we've done here is pull out each individual charging cycle for a year and then built a histogram with it. So the bigger chart shows in the last year, about 14,000 EV charging cycles in our network, and it shows the distribution. And what we see is charges are very frequent and in relatively small amounts. 70% of them are less than 10 kWh, but you also see, a lot grouped in that under 5 area. And what this means is this chart is essentially a combination of how far people drive, the efficiency of their EV, and how often they plug in. And so we kind of know how far people drive, but we don't really know how often they plug in. And that's what this is telling us. It's telling us people are plugging in frequently at home, or even, after they arrive at their destination, whether that's a public EV charger or at work. And that's really encouraging, because when we're talking about managing charging at a high level and managing it in sophisticated ways, we need people to be connected. And so this sample is also is a group of people that are not under any highly managed programs, time of use rates or anything. So these examples we're showing, especially of older data, is people just naturally charging the times that they've developed habits to charge. So seeing them charge in this manner is very encouraging. Now, the bottom of the chart shows this chart over time in our network. And you can see the general shape of the distribution is consistent, but it has flattened a bit over time. And that's mostly a function of EVs that are available. So in the beginning, there were smaller cars with smaller batteries. People were generally taking them on shorter trips. But as larger batteries and vehicles with better range have come out and people are adopting them as their primary vehicle, we see the longer charges become more frequent, and especially that over 20 bar is growing. And I think that will grow a bit more as, the adoption, the sample, would be the same as total adoption. People in the suburbs or the exurbs driving more and more, you're going to see those trips go up. But the general takeaway is, compared to the amount we would expect people to drive, we're seeing people charge very frequently.
And Cavan, one thing that I'd sort of ask a question, and it might be a bit of a leading question here, but on those longer charge events, those tend to be the vehicles with significantly larger batteries, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we are starting to see, probably needs a little bit more research around this, is those folks, the fear around range anxiety is gone, right? And those folks may or may not be charging every day. So we need to dig into that a little bit more, because that connectivity issue that you talked about earlier, right? For us to achieve the full flexibility that we can and we should and we need to, we do need that vehicle connected.
Precisely.
The other thing I'd add is that what you said, that we know how far folks are driving, right? There's a whole lot of prior research around this, where for city/urban areas, the vast majority of daily driving is 30 miles and under total mileage, right? So that tells you again, in this charging, we see that. We believe the majority of these folks are charging at home predominantly, and the number of kilowatt hours versus the average mileage of these vehicles per kilowatt hour tells us that research is correct, that it is under 30 miles.
Yep. Okay. So the next chart shows the same sample overlaid on each other. So this is the total charge load per year by hour of the day on the left. And you can see individual homes are very faint, but ones that charge a lot at the same time of day, you can pick out. And then as the colors get darker at the bottom, that's more and more homes charging at that same time. So that's more load at the same hour of day. And on the right, we pull out the 10 homes with the highest charging for the year. So this is just to show, for homes that are charging a lot, when are they charging? And both of these trends show the flexibility of this. Like I said, most of these people aren't under any management programs, or the majority not even time of use rates. So this is just when they're plugging in and when they're charging. And that's a lends credence to the natural flexibility of this load, not only between homes. So you see each home, often has a different peak time of day to charge, but even individual homes have oftentimes several peaks. So they're charging, their charging is bunched at several times of day. And so that tells us that people can charge at different times of day without an inconvenience. And especially as batteries get larger and trips are, a certain amount that's not going to deplete the battery a lot, we have a lot of flexibility, especially within a day's time, to charge the battery. So what we really need to do is to optimally align the charging patterns to get the results we want from either the grid or home power consumption, whatever. So yeah, this shows the natural flexibility in the load, and what a great opportunity we're going to have to align these as the grid needs them, or as, say, emissions reductions can be optimized. So that's going to be the next step in managed charging. Next slide. This slide shows EV charge in perspective with home load and solar production. So this is a sample of over 40 homes in Austin. All of them have EV chargers and all of them have solar. And here we're showing how load changes with the seasons. Obviously, grid conditions are very seasonal. So when we're thinking about optimizing EV load, we want to look seasonally. And you can see home consumption varies seasonally, as does solar production. EV charging, though, remains pretty static. And that makes sense. People don't change their driving or charging patterns very much depending on the season. So what we'll have, the challenge ahead of us will be to flex the EV load, definitely seasonally and possibly even on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, depending on what we're optimizing for. And so the graph on the right shows how we might want to flex that EV load theoretically. That's not an actual value on the right, but theoretically based on grid conditions or solar production or the overall home consumption. So also on the right, we see these orange bars, which represent ERCOT price. So when the ERCOT real-time locational margin of price is in the top 10 percentile, you'll see the percentage of those times represented by the bar. So in the summer, in the afternoon, in the early evening, we see a lot of time when we're above the 90th percentile in price. And so we want to avoid those times. And that's clearly the strongest signal we see in ERCOT today. And so we also see some bars in the shoulder seasons, which are March, April, October, November, sort of later in the evening. And then in the winter at sunrise and sunset, sunrise, people are turning on their heat, sunset, coming home from work and also lowering their heat. We see a little bit of price signal there. Now, as the grid changes, as homes electrify, Scott will talk about this a little more later, these price signals will change. This isn't static. So that's why some of these more crude ways to manage load, like time of use rates or seasonal free nights or things like that, while effective as things are, as we change the grid from generation to distribution to electrification of homes and home battery integration, we're also going to have to realign charging times. And that's the huge opportunity here, is we have this large battery with an incredibly flexible load, a more flexible load than we've ever seen. And so the challenge is, how can we integrate in a way that we have maximum flexibility to benefit the most? And so, yeah, the flex load shows, just one more second, that slide. In the summer, we're going to the overnight hours when home consumption is low. In the winter, we are maximizing that middle day time when the sun's heating, so our home consumption of heating energy goes down, but we can utilize the unused solar at the home.
I'm going to jump in and add a little bit of color commentary here. So when Cavan first showed me this slide, I immediately thought of some very basic video games, right? Like, there are times where we're going to want to push charging towards solar production. There are other times we're going to want to push charging, vehicle charging away from time. So we're going to be dodging those price bars, those high prices. But then the other thing that dawned on me is, we've seen a number of articles that are correct, and research that is correct for specific regions and specific areas. But there is no one size fits all solution to the dilemma of when to charge. But the good news is that frankly, the vehicles don't care. And those charging patterns that Cavan showed earlier, they're so widespread throughout the day. We used to worry about, everybody coming home and charging at peak. I can't say for sure when somebody is going to be charging. The one constant that we seem to see is that they want to be done charging to get into that vehicle to go to work. So as long as you avoid events in that 6 to 8 p.m. or 6 to 8 a.m. hour when they're trying to have the vehicle done and get to work, you can manage the charging for the vehicle for the rest of the day.
All right.
Hopefully I didn't steal any of your thunder from the managed charging.
Oh, no.
Okay.
So now we'll talk about kind of the current state of charge management and some examples with our data. And then Scott will go on a bit more about sort of the future of managed charging, how we can make these integrations and programs work best. This slide shows some research we did a little over a year ago on our own charging, and it incorporates two major charging themes. One is, as newer EV models are coming out, we're seeing they're able to charge at higher power rates. So whereas in the beginning, 2012, when we started monitoring EVs, we're seeing level 1 chargers or level 2s at maybe 3 or possibly 6 or 7 kW. Now we regularly see 7, 10, even 15, 18 kW. And so that shift is a good thing because we get more flexibility when we can charge in a shorter amount of time. If your optimal window to charge is short, you can fit it all in. But it also can be a liability if you're not paying attention to other grid conditions and charging at a higher power rate because you have more effect on the grid. And so this isn't really a problem at the adoption rates we're at now. But as more people adopt and as charge rates get higher, it will become a problem. And even in the 2 years since we did this research, we're experiencing, higher charger rates. So on the left, you see the core thesis of the paper, which is on the top in green, we're just saying if we took all of our charges over a 2-year period and increased the charge rate, what would be the effect when we look at the ERCOT real-time price? And that price increase was 20%. So we just upgraded the charge rate of the charges that we saw in that period of time. And so we are kind of somewhat along in that journey of increasing charge rates. So we're somewhere on that path. The next is, what if we moved some of these charges? So we just did a very simple time of day moving of 35% of the charge cycles during the day, shifted to overnight hours and into a 4-hour window, and starting them randomly, and it saved almost 40% cost. So just with these two simple phenomena, we can demonstrate what we'll see at a much larger and more complicated level as EV adoption increases, charge rates increase, and overall grid consumption of EVs increase.
And again, this is sort of a lens into our region, right? With ERCOT's high levels of wind production at night and lower prices regionally and various different ISOs. This may be different. The point again is that the flexibility is there to actually do it.
Next slide, go on. The next couple of slides I have just examples with our data showing real events that are sort of examples of the way we're managing load and charging oftentimes in grid emergencies. So this would be, well, I'll give you several examples. This slide shows, one is that probably very familiar to a lot of people, certainly us being in Austin, Winter Storm Uri in 2021, excuse me, from January 31st to March 7th. So this is the few weeks before the event and the few weeks after the event. And the charging during the event is in dark blue. And what we saw was 40% lower charging during the week of the storm than weeks before and after, which is encouraging for a few reasons. First, this was largely unexpected. So we didn't see, and it's important to note, the sample is all homes that had power throughout the entire storm. So many homes did lose power, and we lost the ability, obviously, to track their power. So people who did not lose power are the only ones in this sample. And the people who didn't lose power, importantly, we didn't see a spike when power went out for sort of panic charging. Now, that is, one could be a sign of people heeding conservation pleas, but it also could be a function of the fact that since people plug in almost every time they're at home, their battery is frequently fully charged. And when the power went out in the middle of the night, their battery was full. They didn't need to charge. So that's an advantage of this situation, having a large battery and that you can charge frequently. But we also, did not see any panic charging. Clearly, people weren't driving as much since there was snow on the ground and everything was closed. So That's obviously part of this, but the absence of a negative signal here, I think, is very encouraging. Next slide. This is another example of ERCOT conservation pleas this summer. So on the right, we can see, we all know, people in Texas, this summer was extremely hot. We often exceeded projections. ERCOT often exceeded their own projections for load and previous years' demand records. It seemed like, several times we were setting a demand record day after day after day.
Every day.
So it was hot, and it was in the news, and it was on people's mind. With that in mind, look at the chart on the left. The dark blue is just the summer average, and the gray highlights the hours which are the peak demand hours for the grid. And so we see that kind of growth from mid-afternoon to sort of early to late evening, which does not, optimally coincide with ERCOT demand. We'd want to see less charge in that gray area. But on average this summer, people were just charging when they normally charge, in the same pattern we've seen previous years. Now, there were 3 times when there were official conservation pleas, and those are the 3 in the lighter blue. Now, May 13th, which shows almost no response. If anything, there's a higher than average trend for charging. That was a very hurried. It was issued very quickly, so there wasn't a lot of time for people to get the message and respond. The other 2 in July were after several months of very hot weather, lots of news coverage, and they were issued day ahead. So on those 2 events, we do see some encouraging response for people charging less. But that is sort of the nature of these pleas, especially when there isn't an all-out crisis like in Uri. Some people are going to see it, some people are going to follow it, some people are just doing what they do. And so the theme is we need to make this automatic behind the scenes and make sure it's worth people's while to do it, because there is going to be monetary gain at several levels that can be harnessed and delivered in these kind of programs for managing charging. And the last one I'll show is an example that was very recent. This is the California heat wave in the beginning of September. Now, we have a handful of houses there in the Bay Area. None of them actually were charging over the few days this happened, but I did isolate the HVAC load, which was significant on a grid scale for managing the overall load. What happened was they issued a conservation plea every day from 2 to 8. But on September 6th specifically, they were very close to rolling blackouts, and they sent a text message to all their customers saying, please reduce load. There's very dire circumstances. And you can see on the EAA chart on the right, they got almost 2,000 megawatts of demand response, which is largely credited for them not having to go to rolling blackouts. But with our homes, we saw a significant response as well, right in time, right on that text, for the largest, most controllable load in anyone's home, which is their HVAC. So people saw the text and turned off their HVAC at that time. So that coincided with the overall grid trend as well, which is interesting. And so the point is here, we are getting, some response, and we clearly can see the grid benefits even from these very unsophisticated communications pleading with people to turn off their power use for various devices. And what we need to do going forward, people will have fatigue like we saw in ERCOT this summer with some of the charging. It's not always having the effect that we want. And as this load grows, it will be undeniable that we need to do this behind the scenes and not rely on people to respond in events of emergency. And so we need to set up strong integrations where this can happen automatically, communications where loads are talking to each other within the home, at the distribution level, at the utility level, so that we can optimize for quite a few different variables in this effort. And we need to pay people what it's worth. People aren't getting paid for turning off their air conditioner at this time, most of them. There are some programs, especially in California, that are controlling thermostats and things like that, but not to the level, and many people who did conserve load here weren't paid. just had to pay attention and hope that their power didn't go out. So that's what we want to improve on. In the next slides, we'll go into that. So I'll pass it to Scott here for main narration.
So thank you. So one of the things that, a couple of the main things that we want to make sure that we get across in this webinar is that electric vehicles represent the most flexible load that we've ever added to a residential structure, right? Through our air conditioning demand response programs, depending on exactly how hot it is and exactly how humid it is, we know that somewhere between, if you delay or move people's HVAC usage, somewhere between 15 minutes and 45 minutes, they start to notice. You get much more than 45 minutes and they start to get upset. It's not a good situation to be in. And electric vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, with that needing to be charged for departure to work, right, represent a lot more flexibility than cooking, than HVAC, than pool pumps. The only thing even remotely close would be electric tanked water heaters, because they have so much thermal inertia, but even then their total usage isn't going to come close to this in a day. And so one of the things that we've started to look at is and there's been a number of questions, and hopefully we'll get to more of these during and I've been sort of cheating and looking at the questions. Hopefully we'll get to more of this in the question and answer time, but exactly how do you do this? How do you incorporate this managed charging? How much availability is there going to be for these vehicles to be at home versus at workplace charging and things like that? And these are all significant technical challenges. They're all solvable though, right? One of the things that we do see is sort of a slowdown is the complexity of integrating a fully aware energy management into residential structures. So here's one example. We've pulled this from the manual for the system mentioned here. And you can see that the block diagram for it is fairly complicated, right? And when you actually go to install one of these, because we've done a number of backup energy storage systems, microgrids, and even vehicle to grid systems at Pecan Street. Existing residential construction is not always favorable to this. Now, it can be difficult to do. So that tells us that we need to move quickly to allow new construction or to adopt sort of new construction methods that make this a little bit easier. And then I'll get to this in a little bit, but talk about this a little bit more in a couple more slides. But we also need to have better software-based solutions with communication between devices, allowing for these devices to sort of be aware of other things, operation in the house, and what they should be doing in terms of charge or not charge, or run the air conditioner or not run the air conditioner, those sorts of things. In this case, this example, there is a critical load panel. And when you do this, you've basically decided which portions of your house you're going to keep online in terms of an outage. You're not going to be able to necessarily keep the whole home online. There are whole home transfer switches as well, but then you have to size all of your equipment very carefully and make sure that the inverter resources that are taking energy out of the batteries can handle whatever else that you've got in your home, whether it's one or two air conditioners and things like that. And those demands can add up pretty quickly and get beyond the level of easy or commonly available inverters very quickly. Next slide. So to go back to Cavan's Winter Storm Uri example, I was without power for 3 days. I know that this is for any of the Austin folks on this webinar, and for the Pecan Street employees based in Austin, this was not an uncommon occurrence. We are currently seeing in very rapid order storms, hurricanes that have caused lengthy power outages. There's still a huge swath of Puerto Rico that does not have power. There will be large swaths of Florida that do not have power. And so we wanted to look at, if you had a battery, since we have such high resolution data on the home usage, how long would that last, right? And Cavan, remind me, this is without the addition of solar, right? This is just the battery itself.
Yep.
Okay. So, you know, the chart shows the number of hours of backup that you would have. And again, this was for Winter Storm Uri. So if you had, you know, the vehicles with the 30 to 50 mile all electric range type battery sizes, you could have gotten roughly a day. And as you get to the larger battery sizes, the newly announced trucks, some of the larger passenger, longer range passenger vehicles, you could have gotten a little over 3 days, 3.5 days or so. And that possibly could have carried your entire home through the entire event. Now that there's going to be some care needed, you know, some comfort level adjustment of how low are you willing to let that car battery go so that when the event is over, you can get back on the road. But these are things that are all sort of manageable and personal decisions that are pretty easy to make. I would have let the car get very low had I had the option personally. But you know, you can get through some of these events with the amount of energy storage that's in one of these vehicles. Next slide. So balancing load, next slide. So one of the things that we see, and this sort of, there's a number of ways that it gets talked about. And one that frustrates me is sort of the, what I call the imperfect solution fallacy, where people say, well, if we make this change and the answer isn't perfect for everyone, why bother making the change? And we see this all the time, right? If you fully electrify a home, right? On the left, we show the typical load profile of a gas-assisted home in a very cold day. And you can see that the electricity draw for this home is quite low. Now, it's gas-assisted, meaning that the heat for the home is generated by gas. And so that's where that energy is coming from. And in the Winter Storm Uri event, gas system pressures started to drop. Gas was being shut in and gas system pressures dropped. So there's no universal answer here, right? On the right, you can see where that same home, if it was fully electric, now that energy is coming from electricity, you see a much higher demand. But that up and down also represents a opportunity for electric vehicles to play a role. Next slide. You can, again, the vehicles themselves, there's relatively little impact on the battery system to change charging and to change charge rates. I'm not going to say it's zero, there is some, but it's relatively minor. And now you can use that flexibility, and we have actually designed systems to do this and demonstrated this, that if they are aware of solar production and HVAC usage and things like that, they will modulate the charge rate of the vehicle, and the vehicle responds very quickly. You can get the vehicle, when we did it, the vehicles, if you gave them a new charge rate, you wanted to go from 6 kilowatts to 3 kilowatts, they would do it in less than a second. And so you can really flatten out that home load, and you can fill in the gaps. And this, now the home becomes a lot easier for the utility to serve electricity to, and you mitigate some of the need for the panel upgrades if systems like this are allowed eventually. There's some difficulty now getting systems like this with the NEC, but if they're allowed to do this, you can mitigate some of the need for infrastructure upgrades at the service panel to the home, which is a big cost savings. Next slide. So I've talked about infrastructure a couple of times, and right now there's sort of this, for lack of a better way to say it, very slow race to a solution. We see some movement in policy and I should just go with bullet order here. But one of the things that we need is some standardization, some open source and common frameworks. And there are some standards around this. Open charge point protocol, is out there for electric vehicles. But one of the issues that we still see is that there are standards around inverter communication. There are standards around electric vehicles, but they don't have enough information necessarily. They don't know the whole home draw, for instance, in many cases. There's not enough information and not enough overarching standards to allow everything to be aware of what's happening with the other devices in the home. And that's going to slow us down, and we need to fix that. We need to fix that in a hurry. The other thing is adoption of some of these standards for the charge, for the electric vehicle charge open source standard. There are 3 times as many participants in that standard in Germany as there are in the United States. There's like 5 times as many in Europe as there are in the United States. And so we would like to see more uptake of these things in the United States so that we can be prepared to electrify transportation and do it with minimizing the impact. The next is market structure. There is value in changing this charge behavior of the vehicles. And we've got a couple of things happening right now. But again, I'd sort of like to see them happen a bit faster. And I understand that it can be a little bit difficult to change these rules on a dime, but it does need to move, I think, a little bit faster than it's moving right now. So FERC 2222 allows for aggregation of resources at a much smaller level. Of course, ERCOT in Texas is not necessarily subject to that, but there is a pilot for aggregated DERs. There's getting started. There's a task force set up by the Public Utility Commission of the state of Texas, and then work is going on that. But that's going to be a 3-year pilot, which means that we're at least 2.5, 3 years for rules changes for allowing these in the ERCOT marketplace, right? And the last is workforce development. I would be probably sugarcoating a little too much if I said we could completely get away without panel upgrades and things like that for residential structures. We're not, and we definitely need more electricians and qualified trades to do this work. Both for retrofits and for new homes. These are new systems that are unusual compared to the relatively simple electric panels of the past, but we're starting to see a lot more smart panels that would allow a number of devices to talk to each other in the home and be aware of the status of the other devices. We're seeing more advanced inverters, energy storage systems, and things like that. And we need a lot of workforce training and a lot of new folks doing those jobs in order to keep up with demand. Next slide. Questions? I've been monitoring. I've sort of, Colin, I've sort of looked at the questions rolling in. I think we have a lot.
Yeah, we do. And I've been trying to respond to some of them individually when I'm able. But I want to start with we'll open it up for more questions. I'm still monitoring them, but I wanted to ask a couple that have come in. So for people who have solar on their homes, one of the questions has been, so if you had the individual choice of deciding to charge during the day, should you charge when solar production is highest? And my quick response to that is, well, it depends on whether you're cranking your AC also, but maybe you guys can give a more nuanced, kind of scientific answer to that question.
So I'll jump in there on that one. So it does slightly depend on whether you're cranking your AC, right? Yeah, you're not wrong. But there's a lot to do, a lot of other things to keep in mind in terms of overall capacity of the grid that you're in. This May, when there was so much natural gas and coal outages in the ERCOT grid, right? So the state of Texas, we were running into, that was that sort of hurried conservation notice that Cavan showed. Even if you had solar producing well and weren't running your air conditioner, during times like that, I'd still kind of avoid charging, right? If you're looking at trying to maximize your overall grid impact, those were expensive kilowatt hours at the time. And so you could, in theory, have avoided a pretty expensive charge event.
Got it.
So the answer is
it does depend.
It does depend. 99 days out of 100, it's probably just fine to do that, right? It's that one day that's really important.
Right. One question that I'm going to selfishly ask here, because it speaks to some of the things that we spoke about in previous research. Do you see an opportunity for utilities or maybe anyone else to provide panel upgrade rebates to help balance EV adoption? Maybe we can poke our nose a little bit into the whole panel upgrade issue here.
Sure, I can give it a shot, Scott. So we looked at this pretty closely in a paper released about a year ago, but just looking at a big sample of our homes and what size panel they had, and then if they electrify every load in their home, including an electric vehicle, how many would need a new panel by current rules? And the answer is a lot. Many panels are undersized, especially when a home is gas assisted. People aren't sort of installing larger panels just for when people start getting more electric loads. So that process is obviously a bit onerous. You're going to have to do quite a bit of rewiring. It's thousands of dollars. Now there are rebates in the IRA for this, but in general, it's not something somebody wants to do when they're deciding whether to get a new two-way heat pump or just another gas furnace. So there's a pinch point there that we want to alleviate. And now from the utility side, they're going to have to upgrade transformers and other distribution equipment when people are installing larger panels. So if we can coordinate loads at the home, there's a big opportunity for not making as many expensive equipment upgrades on the distribution side. And so where we solve that problem is still a little undetermined, whether it's coordinating them with a smart panel, whether it's communication between home loads, or whether it's just everybody upgrading their panel and the utility upgrading the service accordingly. I don't think there's a clear sort of path, but it's going to be one of those or a mix. And that's going to be, taking place much faster now that we have our IRA rebates coming into effect next year for all the electric loads in the home and for rewiring and for control panels, electric panels.
Another question, do we have any anecdotal or specific assessments of kind of actual time of use pricing, how that might impact flexibility of charging, anything like that we can share?
Yeah, so a few years ago, in fact, this is sort of a success story as well as a be careful what you ask for because you just might get it story. We did a time of use pricing trial with our participants in Austin. And the thing is that we encouraged folks to charge their vehicles at night, again, when wind energy is so plentiful, when and we see this regularly in the ERCOT market, where there's parts of the state of Texas where the marginal or real-time pricing is negative for energy, right? And we incentivized folks in that pricing trial to charge their electric vehicles at night at about 2 a.m. And we still see to this day, and we always have to account for it when we do our electric vehicle research, we still see people, that habit was formed, and they are still, even though the pricing trial is over, there is no economic benefit for them personally to do that. Austin Energy kind of wins still, but there is no economic benefit for them personally, and they still follow those same charging behaviors, even though they got a new vehicle. They went in and set the new vehicle up for that old charging behavior.
So I guess there are a couple of things here. One is that it kind of does speak to the flexibility of that load when there's incentive, but the other is that if it's not kind of an ongoing request, then it's essentially turns into the same thing as an old thermostat that you would just turn on, put up 78 and leave it there. That there's this connectivity and engagement and this kind of real-time need. If you're going to try to moderate these things daily and an ongoing basis, you've got to have the system that can do that daily and an ongoing basis.
Yes, there has to be the smarts and the communications and the controls there to make those real time. I hesitate to use quite real time, but frequent charge behavior decisions, right? And otherwise, it is going to be like, the thermostat where you just sort of set it and forget it, or the VCR timer where the show's canceled. You're still, for a few weeks, you're still recording something wrong, right? I'm dating myself. But yeah, that smarts definitely needs to be there. And it's built into the vehicle telematics systems. It can be built into the chargers. There's a lot of ways to do this, but again, we're still seeing that siloed interaction that I was talking about, where they're not aware of what's going on around them, and they may or may not be making the right decision.
Right. Another question here: are we aware of utilities that are kind of experimenting in this with time of use trials, things with EV customers?
Yes, there are a number of pilot programs, frankly, all over the country, with commercial charging, so at workplace charging, public charging, and even residential charging. So there's a number of pilot programs, but that's where the markets need to catch up. And even though there's, FERC Order 2222, which allows aggregations of resources as small as 100 kilowatts to bid into energy markets, it didn't mandate an instantaneous sort of uptake of how you actually do that. And there's some areas that are moving relatively quickly, and then there's other areas of the country saying we're not even sure how to do the rules before 2028, 2030.
Got it. Okay. All right. I'm still scrolling through, so if you guys have additional questions, please continue. So here's a question from one of our longtime participants, Dennis Mick. Dennis, thanks for joining us. So if we're able to integrate battery storage into the system, wouldn't ERCOT likely adjust their daily rate structure in response to a shift in demand? Like the price of the energy throughout the day, presumably, if this happens at scale, would also shift, right? The overall price.
Yeah. The pricing, there's going to be, and whenever we've seen changes to the market, right? Early adopters, there's these more wild price fluctuations at the beginning, then it sort of settles out when everybody figures out how it's going to work. So yes, there would be shifts. For ERCOT specifically, as a near lifelong Texas resident, I would say that I'd have a tough time saying envisioning a day when we don't have a summer afternoon peak, right? Like it's just so brutal and so hot with so much air conditioning use. I just don't know if that's going to happen, right? But we are going to see shifts to those pricing signals. The good news is that the vehicle is flexible enough to respond to those shifts.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we did a report looking at what happens when the home electrifies to overall grid demand, and especially when you use two-way heat pumps in a majority of the homes, you're going to see those winter peaks rise up and be competitive with the summer peaks. So you're going to have winter mornings are going to be, somewhat similar depending on rates of adoption to what we see at summer afternoons right now. So that's one way that we definitely envision seeing that changing, but they will always be very flexible depending on what the grid desires.
I kind of want to jump in with one. Maybe you guys can react to this comment of mine, because Scott, you mentioned some of the research about kind of grid impact based on charging rates. There's some great research that got great press last week from our colleagues at Stanford, and that was very focused on the West, charging rates in the West. And I think one of the things that I've been trying to figure out is how we try to, in trying to describe to people who aren't knee deep in this, kind of what the key to all of this charging is. And it seems to be about flexibility. So not only do we have a very flexible charge, but there isn't going to be a one size fits all response to how do we accommodate this new load. Depending on where you are, it's going to matter, depending on what your climate is, depending on what your fuel mix is, depending on your utilities, I don't know, interest in being proactive in embracing electrification. And then of course there are the non-grid social impacts of it. Pecan Street's very focused on climate justice and making sure that when we spend billions of dollars on this new infrastructure, that we're doing it equitably. And so the need to have charging stations in parts of Texas or parts of California that make it realistic for lower income families to go electric is a big part of making sure that segment of the population can go electric. And so I just kind of wanted to, maybe we can just talk about general flexibility and making sure that we're thinking about this not as we found the one solution, or this is a problem that's kind of insurmountable. It's going to be very, very different depending on where we are and what kind of goals we're trying to achieve.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, you could drive charging behavior based on different signals of importance, right? So we've talked about electricity pricing. We showed that. But you could also link it to emissions. If you could link it to emissions by region, if you wanted to, like if you know where those vehicles are. So there's a number of ways that you could inform a charge now or charge later decision. If you expect that, that you've got a pretty short-term solar peak and cloud covers moving into the region, you may force a bunch of chargers on. You may, but you may not, depending on if you miss and you think you might miss the right window, and if you have to fire up a bunch of fast turn on high emitting thermal generation, right? Like maybe you avoid that. So there's the key here is that the flexibility is there, but we need to use it. Unlike the predominant aspect right now, where folks just buy the vehicle, they get the charger installed, and they sort of move on, right? And we need to have the ability be open so that whoever ends up being sort of the arbiter of that signal of hey, it's a good idea to charge or not, can get that signal out to the right vehicles.
Got it. We got a policy question here.
Okay.
I love when Scott and Cavan get to put on their policy hats. So when it comes to
we'll see how we do.
Maybe I'll switch that to regulation, whether it's regulation or policy. When it comes to some of these things that we're asked, that we've said we need, standardization, kind of incentives, things like that. What beyond what we've seen so far with FERC 2222 and the spending from IRA and things like that, what other kinds of regulatory or policy efforts could speed this up? or get us into a place where from the technical side, you guys could see maybe a more fluid or more productive adoption rate?
That's a good question. I think I would love to see more options around load management and panel sizes in the National Electric Code. Colin or Cavan, would you agree with that? You'd like to see that and sooner? I'd love to see building codes require larger panels for new builds, like right now. I don't think the number that we came up with in our study, Cavan, was 200 amp, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
For the requirement.
as if that is done when a home is under construction, a new home is under construction, that incremental cost is a couple $100. So if you think about that in terms of the cost of the whole home, that's nothing, right? So there's some simple things that we could do now. On the, I'd love to see some national standards, whether or not they're industry driven or regulatory driven around, and you're seeing it, you see it for solar inverters, right? But I'd love to see a more all-encompassing system for residential and frankly, multifamily load management and things like that.
Cavan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, just echo Scott, the electric panel requirement is crucial. We're building, millions of homes a year with undersized panels. So California has effectively mandated this through their energy code, but the rest of the country hasn't. So there's different ways to get that, effect to have a panel size adequate for a fully electric home. But everywhere needs to have that, and every home needs to be built with that. Similar to some of the stuff Scott was talking about, integrating V2H home backup. It's very difficult to retrofit. It's much easier to start from the get-go. So getting that just started, so we're not just stopping the bleeding of building inadequate homes for these sort of integrations. California recently stopped the requirement for an individual EV meter, which makes it easier. So finding opportunities in these complicated integrations to simplify all throughout that pipeline is going to be huge, and I think a lot of it's yet to be seen. But now that the adoption is moving, from just a niche group of interested people to everybody, I think this is the opportunity everyone's waiting for. So I don't doubt that we will see a lot more efficiencies in the hardware and the programs and the policy specifically too, just because it will be such a missed opportunity to not have a policy in place where these things aren't available as the masses adopt.
One more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. So I know we talked briefly earlier about the work that we did on the V2G work, but there's a question about, rather than just EVs providing power to the home where they are, there's a question about using that kind of aggregated EV power to supplement the grid. And so Scott or Cavan, if you can maybe talk about the dispatchable work that we did with Austin Energy with the stationary batteries and then the Nissan Leaf, and kind of how well that performed. If you can just give a quick recap.
Sure. So we did as part of a program with Austin Energy, we acted as a system aggregator for some homes with fixed energy storage, and we also installed vehicle to grid, and we lumped those charger here in our own facility, and we lumped those resources together and presented them as a single resource to Austin Energy. And they had a system that was doing, and this was at the distribution level, so this was not a transmission level pilot program, but this is at the distribution level. So they were looking at energy arbitrage, pricing signals, voltage control, thing like that, to inform whether or not we should be charging or discharging those batteries. And the systems worked well, right? There's always challenges for scaling up systems like that. So when you're talking under 25 total monitored resources, that's one thing. When you go to tens of thousands, which like the pilot for aggregated resources in Texas, the PUC Workforce Commission, that thing's going to land somewhere in the 10 to 80 megawatt range. So that is a spread across the state. So that is a much different thing
Resource,
to manage, right? In terms of getting that online. But I mean, the technology's here, it can be done. You have to there's a whole bunch of minutia that needs to be worked out, but it's here and it can be done.
Yeah, the hardware's here. And so
Yes.
a lot of it is the system management and the software of it.
System management software, and then exactly, and there's so much minutia of exactly, is it a non-spin resource? There's all this sort of policy, which can have major implications on payout and how effective it is.
We're right at time, so let me just make a quick note, and then I'm going to kick it back to you guys for maybe some final thoughts. Several people have asked if we're going to make these slides available. Yes. So if you go to our events page, today's event will be updated later on today with a YouTube video of this webinar and a PDF of the slide deck. So give me some time to edit those things, get them online, and they'll be there later today. So thank you guys for your questions. They'll be available later on today. Always check out pecanstreet.org/events for our events. I said at the beginning, I'll repeat, if you got this invitation from someone other than Pecan Street, email media@Pecan Street, and we'll get you on our distribution list for the next webinars, whether it's EV or anything. And also please check out pecanstreet.org for blogs and reports. I will point out one other thing. Cavan mentioned a previous report that we had done on panel sizing. If you go to pecanstreet.org/publications, you will see a list of all of the reports that we've done over the last couple of years in chronological order. So you can search through them and they're free to download. We'll ask for your email address, but it's free other than that. So I'm just going to pass it to Cavan and Scott. Cavan, any final words to leave folks with?
I just think the biggest point we wanted to get across, and I'll reiterate it, is this is the best opportunity we've seen in a long time. We are home energy, experts and sort of nerds, and we've been talking about this future forever, and it's here. And we need to really embrace it and do our best to extract the value out of it, because there's so much value. And so the opportunity can't be overstated. And working together, so encouraged to see all the turnout we've had and the questions. So I look forward to following up and interacting in any way we can to work together to make the best of this situation. And yeah, thank you to everyone.
I don't have anything to add. That was great, Kevin.
Perfect. All right, I've never heard Scott say I don't have anything to add, so this is fantastic. I want to thank you to Cavan and Scott for the work that it took to get this into presentation format. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Again, we'll be posting this on the event page later on with the YouTube link. Please, if there's anyone that you think might be interested, please send them to that page. Until our next webinar, thank you guys for joining us, and y'all have a great afternoon.